Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once again, we'll be talking about some strange things. Before we get going, I just finished R. Gary Patterson's book, A Walk on the Dark Side. It's all about rock and roll legends and myths. If you're into history or rock and roll, or you just like good books, you should check it out. He talks about Buddy Holly's curse and what some folks believe about Led Zeppelin. Not to mention the 27 Club. Gary also talked about Pink Floyd. As far as I know, there aren't any curses or legends surrounding Pink Floyd, but there is a bit of a mystery. I'm sure you've seen The Wizard of Oz. Based on the Oz books, a series that begins with the wonderful Wizard of Oz, written in 1900 by L. Frank Baum. It's the fictional history of the land of Oz. Baum, who went on to write 14 full-length Oz books. And you should know the record, The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, if you play The Dark Side of the Moon while watching The Wizard of Oz, the two are in sync. It's really weird. I tried it, and the music goes hand in hand with the movie. The movie is 102 minutes, and the recording is 102 minutes. As each scene in the movie unfolds, the music changes to coincide with what you're watching. You can now watch the whole thing on YouTube. Just search Wizard of Oz, Dark Side of the Moon. When the movie starts, you won't hear anything. You have to watch up until the credits are half through before the music starts. Then it all matches just too well. I've watched it 3 times now. Pink Floyd denies they did this on purpose. They claim it's all just a coincidence. I, for one, don't believe in coincidence. Is there a cool legend, or just people seeing things that aren't there? I'd love to know who the first person was to figure this out. Someone at some point in time was watching The Wizard of Oz, or he was listening to The Dark Side of the Moon and said, "Hey, these match." I'm pretty sure drugs were involved. Check it out for yourself. This next story was requested by Watches 1000. It seems to be my biggest fan. Late one evening, December 9th, 1965. It was cold and clear. At about 6 p.m., a fireball was spotted coming from the northwest heading southeast at an incredible rate. The fireball was seen as it passed over Canada. Then it entered the United States airspace. It flew over Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario. As it passed overhead, the fireball was dropping small burning debris that started fires in a field in Ohio. The people heard a sonic boom as the object passed them by. Had the fireball continued on its course, it would have passed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A lot of people had heard about the display, and they went out to see if they could watch the flaming object. As it was nearing the ground, the folks were amazed to see it change direction. The flaming object turned. It looked to be slowing down as well. At about 6:15, as the unknown object was coming close to Kecksburg, it vanished into a wooded area. One boy said he saw the flaming object as it came to a halt in the woods. Others heard a crash as the thing hit trees on its way to the ground. The ground shook as the object struck. A speculation as to what the flaming object might have been began before the object had stopped flying. Some thought it was an airplane and rushed to the crash site. Others thought it might have been a missile that had gone astray. If it was a missile, they didn't want to get too close in case it blew up. The idea it was a meteorite was still kicked about by folks who hadn't seen or heard about how the thing had changed direction and slowed before hitting the trees. Then there were the people who said this was a spacecraft coming from beyond our solar system. The fire department was called to the scene. Frances Kelp had phoned the WHJB radio station in Greenburg and said she and her children had seen a fiery object as it crashed into the wooded area. She described it as looking like a four-pointed star. A local reporter, John Murphy, called the Pennsylvania State Police and he gave them the report. Then he rushed to the scene as well, hoping to get a jump on all the big news agencies. Murphy interviewed Mrs. Kelp as he waited to see what the state police would find. The police were searching the woods looking for either a crashed plane or maybe a missile. As the state police were finishing up their search, they called the military to come to the scene. They told Murphy the Air Force would handle the scene from here on. When pressed for more information, Murphy was told to contact headquarters for an official statement. He made contact with Captain Drusia at State Police Headquarters in Greenburg. Murphy was instructed to visit the office to receive an official statement on the search party's results. He arrived at the headquarters at around 7:30, just after a large contingent of military personnel had arrived. It looked more like an invasion force than a search mission. There were armed soldiers standing by waiting for orders. Once inside, Murphy went to the captain's office to get the official report. The story was, after searching the woods from one end to the other, the state police found nothing. They had found no plane crash or errant missile, no flying saucer or Russian spacecraft. Nothing. The official statement went, "The Pennsylvania State Police have made a thorough search of the woods. We are convinced that there is nothing whatsoever in the woods." So they called the military to come to the scene and take over. Think about that. They found nothing, so they called the military. Back in 1965, if you wanted to make a phone call, there was no such thing as a cell phone. You could use a car phone if you could afford one. The car phone was originated by the Bell system and was first used in St. Louis June 17, 1946. It was not cheap, and the equipment was bulky. No, if you were going to make contact, you needed a payphone, which could be found on many street corners. Usually, most police stations, gas stations, and restaurants had payphones set outside. After turning in his report to the radio station, Murphy stood around looking for a story to write. He overheard some of the state policemen who had searched the woods talking about what they had seen. They were saying things about blue pulsating lights. It sounded as if there was something to be seen in the woods after all. Murphy was told that an officer was about to head back to the site that wasn't a crash site, and the military were going to the woods for no known reason, since the official story was there was no story. Murphy was surprised when he was given permission to go along on the second search. He soon discovered he was invited to go along as far as the military cordon. Once he was at the edge of the woods, he was not allowed to actually go into the woods. Men with guns were there to see to it he stayed on his side of the line. The military had been busy roping off the woods and keeping anyone away from nothing. A lot of effort went into protecting nothing. The military had sealed off the area and were keeping all civilians out of the wooded area. The story of the crash soon made newspapers and television, and the area was quickly overflowing with people wanting to get a first-hand look and hear any scuttlebutt on what was turning into possibly an historic event. The military set up checkpoints to keep people from the city from driving out to the woods to look at nothing. As the night crawled on, the folks began to resent the military not allowing them on land that was not owned by the government. The official story was still saying there was nothing there, so why were there men with guns telling folks what they could and couldn't do? By the next morning, some people were located who had made the trip into the woods just minutes before the military had arrived. These people had something to tell. It soon became common knowledge that some eager and interested civilians had made a trip into the woods before the military gained control of the area. These few individuals were interviewed by Stan Gordon, and they told an amazing story. Stan Gordon had been conducting investigations of mysterious encounters in Pennsylvania since the early 60s. He had conducted thousands of UFO and other strange reports from all over the Keystone State. In late 60s, Stan was the sighting coordinator for UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh. Stan had been internationally recognized as an author on the subject of UFOs and Bigfoot. Stan got to the witnesses before the military could threaten them to keep their mouths shut. They stated that they saw a copper or bronze-colored, round-shaped object that had crashed in the woods. This craft was anywhere from 9 to 12 feet in length and bore a gold band around its bottom. The gold band had what looked like writing on it. If you remember the Rendlesham Forest UFO landing from December 1980, Sergeant James Peniston had seen what looked like writing or pictographs along the bottom edge of the craft he'd touched. Some of the Kecksburg witnesses described writing on the craft which resembled Egyptian hieroglyphics. When the military discovered the witnesses had seen something, they rounded up everyone they could and took them away for questioning, which amounted to threats. Not having anything quite so exciting to draw them away, many people stayed on the outside of the military barricades and watched. If you've never watched soldiers standing there looking mean and efficient, it gets dull fast. But some folks stuck it out, hoping for something to happen. Had something like World War of the Worlds happened, they wanted to be there to see it. They were soon rewarded when an army truck came from the woods, hauling something covered by tarps. The truck was passed through the cordon and drove away into the early morning gloom. They said it was going very fast. This was followed by the soldiers jumping into the trucks and following. Once the area was vacated, the people walked into the woods, but there was nothing left to be found. Then somebody spotted that many of the trees had their tops broken along in a straight line, going in the direction that the craft had reported to have come from. The broken treetops became mid-tree, and then entire trees were knocked over. There was a trench at the end of the destruction. Something had come down in the woods, but the Air Force had removed everything they could find. It's 270 miles from Kecksburg, Pennsylvania to Dayton, Ohio. Why is this important? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is in Dayton, Ohio. Wright-Pat is the location of the Foreign Technology Research Unit of the Air Force. If a Russian MiG were captured, it would be sent to Wright-Pat for dismantling and reverse engineering. If a flying craft from outside our solar system were found, it would also have gone to Wright-Pat. There were quite a few witnesses at Kecksburg who said the military arrived at the crash site around 8 o'clock or so. It's 270 miles from Wright-Pat to Kecksburg, yet the military arrived at just a few hours after the fireball was first spotted passing from Canada into the U.S. airspace. How did the Air Force personnel arrive so soon after the initial report from the state police? 270 miles in a military vehicle? In 2 hours? It looked as if they were already on the way long before the state police called them, as if they had been tracking the fireball as it moved across the states. There were several National Guard and Air Guard units closer, but it would have taken time to activate these units. A few Air Force personnel did stay behind and ask questions of the folks watching, what they'd seen or what they thought they'd seen. As the last military unit drove away into the morning, the people living in Kecksburg were left with only questions. What had just happened? Stan Gordon did his best to track down any witnesses and ask them to tell about what their experiences. Some had been scared into denying they had seen anything, but a few airmen that were walking through the woods looking for something. Then there were the people who had a real reason to go into the woods despite there being danger of an explosion or fire. A volunteer fire department went looking for their aircraft in hopes of rescuing any survivors. They talked about slipping into the woods a few hours before the Air Force arrived. They had walked in the direction they thought the fireball had been heading. In the distance, they'd seen blue smoke drifting up from the ground, and the smoke slowly dissipated, but it did give them a direction of travel. They walked to where the smoke had been seen, and there, on the ground, was what looked like a giant metal acorn. It was taller than a man, and it was made from some shiny metal with no seams or rivets. It had no wings and no motors. The thing looked as if it might have been poured from molten metal. There was no openings or ways to get inside. Only part of the craft was visible because the craft was partially buried in the trench it had dug as it crashed to the ground. The first firefighters and state police walked around looking at the craft from a bit of a distance. A few got close enough to see this was not an airplane. Then the state police decided it was time to get out of there. They figured it would be best to let the Air Force know what they had found and let them handle it. The firefighters followed the state police away from the craft. The military kept everybody away from the crash site while men dressed in white hazmat suits went in carrying a large container. Some witnesses said these men had NASA patches on their uniforms. The fact that these men were carrying a container into the area showed they had some kind of prior knowledge as to what they might find in the woods. They had come prepared. Later, when the truck drove out of the woods with something big on the trailer, the object was wrapped in tarps and coverings of some kind. Stan was contacted by a former Air Force security policeman who told Stan he'd been at Lockburn Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. He was in a unit that had been assigned to guard the object from Kecksburg when it arrived in the early morning hours of December 10th, 1965. He remembers there had been extreme security measures at the time. The object was only at the base for a short time, and then it was relocated to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. Once the craft was on Wright-Pat Air Force Base, it vanished into a secret world of the government. On the base is a hangar with a reputation. Hangar 18 is where UFOs were said to go, only to vanish. How could this be possible? The floor of Hangar 18 was dug up at some time in the early 70s. Then a hole was continued down under the base, which connected to tunnels that ran in all directions. The craft was supposed to have been lowered into one of these tunnels, and then the floor was redone in concrete. The entire area Wright-Patterson Air Force Base covers is supposed to be honeycombed with tunnels that are used for secret government research. Things that those of us who pay the bills never get to see or hear about. Radio host Ray Ashbury received a call around 10 at night asking who John Murphy was. The caller was from the parent station in New York. Ron told them that John was a good reporter and he wasn't prone to flights of fancy. The New York office said John had been turning in reports of a crashed UFO near Kecksburg, and they wanted to be sure that he wasn't nuts. Later that night, Ray received another call from New York telling him the Kecksburg story was no longer to be reported on. It would appear the military were putting a gag order out on the UFO crash. A few days later, John Murphy had been putting together a radio show to talk about the object in the woods. He was going to interview witnesses as to what they'd seen in the wooded area on December 9th. The night of the radio show, John had to announce the witnesses had all backed out, stating they didn't want to get in bad with the state police or the military. John went ahead with the show, but he had to pretty much put the show together on air. Everything he had planned had to be changed at the last second. After the redacted show was broadcast, John's wife noticed a change come over him. He'd had papers scattered all about dealing with the incident. He kept files and papers everywhere. After the radio show, he no longer had any of these papers, and he refused to talk about the crash or anything to do with the radio show that had been so poorly put together. Freedom of the press in the United States is legally protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. This amendment is generally understood to prevent the government from interfering with the distribution of information and opinions. Only under certain conditions is the press to be censored. In the case of national security, say we're at war, or there's some state secret vital to our interests, it can be squashed, or if the subject matter is covered by the right to privacy, then the press can be put out as well. So can we say the crash at Kecksburg presented a national security breach? Or was it the right to privacy? Well, the press was being constrained by the government as far as that story went. They even confiscated recordings John had made to use on his show. John's wife went on to say the night of the crash, John had phoned her and told her he had his film confiscated by the military. He said they'd taken the film from his camera, but he had other rolls in his pocket, already exposed rolls. He also carried a tape recorder and a notebook, which he had managed to hang on to. After his radio show had been stepped on so badly, John kept everything to himself, but it was theorized that he had some photos of the crashed object. His wife said he had told her about them. He did send a copy of the taped radio show to Stan Gordon for research purposes. In February 1969, Murphy was struck and killed by an unidentified hit-and-run car while crossing a road. The hit-and-run occurred near Ventura, California, while Murphy was on vacation. The driver was never identified. The official story was John Murphy was killed as he crossed a road in the dead of night to look at an oil slick on the ocean. The car that hit him was traveling at over 60 miles an hour. Shortly after the death of John Murphy, the recordings sent to Stan disappeared. Other than Stan Gordon, few people paid much attention to the Kecksburg UFO story. It was lost in the day-to-day news stories. It went from a crash to a meteorite to never having happened. The Air Force claimed the incident never happened and they were never in Kecksburg area. The media accepted the Air Force's word on what happened or didn't happen. Those in power were just sitting back and waiting for the whole matter to simply vanish into history. But then the TV show, Unsolved Mysteries, began putting together a story about the Kecksburg crash. Some folks living in Kecksburg signed a petition trying to stop the show from being aired. They made claims that the show was pointless and would only make the people living there look foolish. The people that wanted the show to go on stated that no one who signed the petition had actually seen anything. Some hadn't even been living in town at the time of the incident. Even UFO investigators got involved in the air or don't air controversy. Some self-proclaimed ufologists said the Kecksburg UFO crash had never happened. Way back when UFOs were being seen flying over Stevensville, Texas, Bill Burns had a similar problem. They had driven into town hoping to film an episode of UFO Hunters. While in town, they ran into problems from other ufologists who were trying to stake a claim on the sightings and all the witnesses. Other groups would tell the people not to talk to Bill and his crew. Other researchers were stepping on each other, trying for an exclusive on the story. UFO researchers tend to spend so much time stabbing each other in the back they can't get on with the actual work at hand. To me, this sounds like a scheme to make researchers all look bad, so no one will listen to them. Yes, I'm saying it's a conspiracy. No theory involved. Government disinformation agents are out there and they prey on people who are looking for the truth. The 1990 Unsolved Mysteries about the Kecksburg crash was aired. This brought out more witnesses who felt driven to get their story out. I'm going to take a brief pause here and play a couple of commercials and drink some coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. Coffee makes the world go round, and around here we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. Welcome back to the show. Stan Gordon did more research and found reports of people who had seen the original fireball. He discovered the fireball had come south out of Canada, then it made a sharp turn near Cleveland, Ohio. As it was now going in an easterly direction, it passed Greensburg, Pennsylvania, and then it turned south. Observers said the object was slowing down as it flew overhead. The fireball then turned northeast before coming to ground near Kecksburg. You don't see this kind of maneuvering from meteorites. The military put out word that the crashed object had been nothing more than space debris that had finally fallen out of orbit and crashed into the ground. This appeased some folks who hadn't looked into the weird maneuvers made as the craft came down. The space debris would have come down in a straight line. Just like at Roswell, the Air Force changed their story and began saying the object had been a meteorite. Then, they said after searching the woods, nothing was found. Now we're getting back to the nothing there story. The eyewitnesses agreed that right after the crash, there were blue flickering lights in the woods, and then the military drove out hauling something on the bed of a truck. The civilians who had been trying to see the object said the Air Force personnel who chased him off were from the 662nd Radar Squadron, based in Pittsburgh. Stan requested a log from the night of December 9th, 1965, but there was no record of the unit ever having left their base. This falls in line with Roswell once more. Roswell Army Airfield, or RAAF, administrative records from March 1945 through December 1949, and RAAF outgoing messages from October 1946 through December 1949 were destroyed, wiping out all of 1947 records. The document disposition form does not indicate what organization or person destroyed the records, and when or under whose authority the records were destroyed. According to Army regulations, these records should not have been destroyed for any reason. After the television show ran, 2 new witnesses came forward. One was another USAF officer at Lackbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. He said in the early hours of December 10th, a truck had arrived by the back gate, which was seldom if ever used. Armed men were sent to the hangar where the truck was parked and ordered to keep everyone away. Their orders were, shoot anyone who came too close. Inside the hangar sat a truck with a trailer that held a large cupboard shape that kind of looked like a bell. The next evening, the truck and its cargo were gone, en route to Patterson. The other witness was a building contractor who was told to bring a load of bricks to one of the hangars. The contractor didn't say which hangar it was. He managed to sneak a peek into the hangar and saw what looked like a bell covered with tarps sitting on the floor. He guessed the object was about 10 or 12 feet tall. Several men were walking around the object dressed in white hazmat suits. They looked as if they were examining this bell-shaped object. Apparently someone caught him looking, but instead of getting into trouble, the contractor was told he'd just seen an object that would become common knowledge in about 20 years or so. This might have been said to keep him from talking, thinking he was an insider to a government secret. The contractor said the bricks he had delivered matched the bricks of the hangar. He got the impression the military was going to build a wall around the ship that would look as if it were part of the existing structure. The contractor also said he'd seen what looked like a body laying on a table near the craft. The body had 3 fingers on each hand and looked to be green or gray with scales like a lizard. If you want to watch the segment, just go to YouTube and search for Unsolved Mysteries, Kecksburg, and you can see the entire story. If you go to Kecksburg today, you'll see a model of the flying object mounted on a stand. This was the model used while filming Unsolved Mysteries. The model sits near the Kecksburg fire station. An ophthalmologist living nearby was called to the clinic to examine a patient just after the Kecksburg crash. Dr. McCaskill was presented with a 17-year-old boy. The military escorts told the doctor the boy had been burned at Kecksburg, but they wouldn't say how. The doctor examined the boy's eyes and saw the corneas were white and opaque. The doctor said the best course of treatment was to observe the patient and see what would happen. The military men wouldn't say what happened, and they told the doctor no medical report was to be made. They left, and the doctor never did learn what became of the patient. Some investigators actually believed the government story. They told people there was nothing to the Kecksburg UFO crash. Stan Gordon didn't buy it. He had talked to the eyewitnesses, unlike some researchers who do all their investigation through public information announcements. The government says this and I believe them, so therefore nothing here to see. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Stan decided there was a cover-up going on, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it. He continued asking questions and digging in what had happened that December night. Gordon took his findings to the next level, producing a 92-minute documentary video of his findings titled Kecksburg: The Untold Story, which is also available at YouTube. You will be bombarded with commercials, but you can skip them after just a few seconds. Operation Blue Book was in gear at the time of the crash. Their official report says the object that came down in Kecksburg was a meteorite. The report also said that a team of 3 men had been dispatched to the scene to investigate. The report concluded by saying nothing was found at the scene. The Blue Book report places the crash at Acme, Pennsylvania, instead of Kecksburg. If you look closely at a map, you will see that Acme is only a short ways southeast from the actual site. Soon the folks who don't want to know, or they were too scared to admit the truth, began coming out with stories to cover what had happened. One story says the object was actually a re-entering Russian spacecraft, Cosmos 96, a Venus probe that went astray. The claim was the military rushed to the scene in order to grab the Russian spacecraft so they could study it. The armed guards were there just to keep people safe because the Russians used nuclear power on some of their space probes. It sounds good, believable. Military just have our best interests at heart. The Cosmos 96 was a Soviet spacecraft intended to explore Venus. The craft was launched November 23, 1965, but due to a launch failure, it did not depart low Earth orbit. On December 9th, the Cosmos re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and burned up as it came. It began its descent at around 3 p.m. and was nothing but ashes by 3:30, long before the Kecksburg craft was seen. This didn't stop people from saying the Kecksburg craft was nothing more than a Soviet space probe. If this had been what came down, then the UN treaty saying any spacecraft launched into space that came down in someone else's country had to be returned to the country of origin. But that's just a piece of paper a bunch of folks had signed. Probably not worth much when it came to learning what the other guys were doing. Then someone said the Kecksburg craft was actually an engine from an SR-71 Blackbird. We don't know how many Blackbirds were built. It was a secret project. We do know that none of them crashed in 1965. There would have been a report even if a secret plane had come down in any state in the country. Some of the witnesses were shown an artist rendering of what an SR-71 engine would have looked like had one fell from the sky and landed in the woods. A few of the witnesses said the drawing did look kind of like what they had seen. If an SR-71 had exploded over Ohio and parts were flung into Pennsylvania, what happened to the rest of the plane? There should have been a lot of reports of bits and pieces falling to the ground. The witnesses didn't say the drawing was what they saw. They said it looked kind of like it. Remember, it was dark, and the witnesses were kind of shook up, not knowing if they just might find some dead folks laying about from a crashed plane or not. Some folks began blaming our neighbors to the north. They said the Kecksburg object was a giant projectile fired from an enormous cannon mounted on rails, kind of like Dora and Gustav. Okay, who the heck were Dora and Gustav? In the 1930s, France had constructed the Maginot Line, which was a series of fortifications and obstacles intended to protect the country against invasion from Germany. You heard about it last week. The Maginot Line was to serve as an impenetrable wall of defense. Naturally, when one country develops a new defensive technology, other countries rush to develop a way to defeat that technology. After studying details of the Maginot Line fortifications that were conveniently published in the French newspapers, a really swift idea, put all the details about your defenses in the papers. Maybe they thought this would scare the Germans into not trying anything. In 1935, the Wehrmacht requested Friedrich Krupp, a heavy industry conglomerate in Essen, Germany, to begin ballistics tests for guns that would fire shells big enough to penetrate the French defenses. The weapon had to be powerful enough to be fired outside the range of the French artillery. The projectile needed to be able to penetrate either 3 feet of armor or 23 feet of reinforced concrete. The Germans wanted something so big it would shock the pants off of everyone. The Krupp Company built 2 huge cannon, which they named Dora and Gustav, after the founder of their company, Gustav Krupp, and his wife. The Gustav was 155 feet long, 23 feet wide, and 38 feet tall. The barrel was 106 feet 7 inches long. Mounted to the cradle were 4 hydraulic recoil absorbers. The gun's carrier was supported by 4 railroad trucks. Those are the things train wheels are mounted on. 2 in the front and 2 in the rear. Each of the 8 trucks was made up of 5 sets of wheels, giving the Gustav a total of 80 wheels that were set on 2 parallel sets of railroad tracks. The gun used a diesel-powered generator to provide power in order to run its operations. In addition to needing parallel tracks, the Gustav required its tracks to be curved. The gun could not be turned from side to side, so in order to aim to the left or the right, the entire train-mounted gun had to be moved along the curve. Extra bracing was added to the inside rail of both tracks along the shooting curve. This bracing helped prevent the tracks from being damaged due to the gun's recoil. A Dora was just a little bit smaller than the massive Gustav. A Gustav fired a 31-inch shell which could travel 30 miles away. The Kecksburg object was at least 6 to 8 feet across. Now think about how big the cannon that fired a 6-foot across shell would have to be. The circumference of the Gustav shell was 97 inches. So the diameter of the the circumference of the Kecksburg object would have to have been 226 inches. This would have given the Kecksburg object mass of over 5 times that of the Gustav shell. I doubt the Canadians would go to all that much work when they could just as easily just drop bombs instead of firing them. And why would they be shooting at us? And Canada is like our cousins, only really cold. The closest Canada gets to Kecksburg is 225 miles. Gustav could fire 30 miles. Yes, with modern technology, this shell could have been lobbed a lot farther, but still, with rocketry having dominated the air in the 60s, why even bother building such a weapon? Had Canada built a cannon that could fire an enormous shell, I'm sure we would have known about it. The Mackenzie brothers would have talked. No, I don't think the Kecksburg object was a shell of any kind. Now, how about the Nazi bell? If you listened last week, you heard about this strange Nazi device that was secretly built in the Owl Mountains in the late 1945. The device was called the bell because, well, it looked like a bell. It was built using ancient manuscripts found in India. Once the manuscripts were translated into German, the Nazis got their best scientists busy building and recreating this object. We don't know what the Nazi bell was. Some say it was an anti-gravity device that was based on the Indian legends of the Vimanas. Others think the bell was a time machine. Had this been the case, the Nazis would have been able to send bombs back in time and bury them anywhere they wished. Then, at the appropriate time, simply detonate them. Say, under Westminster, in London, or Buckingham Palace. Since you were burying the bomb and not carrying it, you could build it as big as you wanted. Or you could go back in time and arrange for a more fascist government to grow up in England and then just waltz in as their allies. The question that keeps coming to my mind is, how would you control it? Not direction-wise, but through time. You would need some really fantastic calculations to get the machine to go to the time you wished and the place where it was heading. I doubt that computer in the DeLorean on Back to the Future would have been big enough or strong enough. Not being a physicist, I can't even come close to these answers. But looking at the description of both the Nazi bell and the Kecksburg object, you do see an awful lot of similarity. Really, the only thing missing would have been the swastika painted on the side, and it just might have burned off as the object flew through the atmosphere. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. A Sherlock Holmes written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The cannon shell is just too bizarre. The engine from an SR-71 spy plane, it doesn't make sense. Russian satellite, maybe, but satellites aren't very strongly built. They don't have to survive re-entry. The builders only make them strong as would be necessary in outer space. A Russian satellite or exploratory vehicle would not have plowed a trench through the woods. There are pictures on the internet of what are claimed to be crashed satellites. If you look at them, you'll see that the dish is still intact. The dish would have been the first thing destroyed as the craft came through the atmosphere. Now, those dishes are not very sturdy. Maybe what people are thinking could have been the power source for a space vehicle. Those had to be strong enough to hold radioactive material. Had Russia sent this thing into outer space and it fell back down, wouldn't they have been tracking it? As soon as it hit the ground, there should have been yelling and screaming from Moscow, asking for their craft back. Seeing as they didn't say anything, I say we can put an X through the satellite as well. What are we left with? Nazi Bell and space aliens. The bell is a very attractive answer. It also makes for a really cool mystery. It sounds like a novel by Dean Koontz. If you get a chance, I highly recommend you read Lightning by Dean Koontz. It's about time travel. It's a cool story. Looking at the path it traveled, the object came down from Canada. Germany is 4,000 miles away, and it's more in line with Canada than the United States. But then, we don't really know where Kammler went with that huge airplane he'd borrowed from Himmler. Kammler might have flown into Greenland and then northern Canada. There are vast spaces in Canada where nobody lives. But as a friend of mine would say, it's too many moving parts. It would be neat if the Kecksburg object were the Nazi Bell, but I'll wait for more evidence to come forward before I consider it as the answer. So what is left is what I think is the most logical answer. The Kecksburg object came from outer space, maybe another solar system. The naysayers will say it's too far. It would take hundreds of years to travel back and forth from the closest star system. Well, maybe the aliens came here a long time ago and they never went back to where they're from. Perhaps the mothership is stationed in orbit around some planet and we just don't know it's there. Had there been creatures in the craft, why didn't the aliens come looking for their buddies? Most of the descriptions of aliens say they have no sex organs and no means of processing food. The only time food is mentioned involving aliens is that strawberry ice cream eating thing. Just about everybody has heard about how the aliens like strawberry ice cream. What can I say? This was not attributed to the Greys, but to what sounded more like a lizard being. The story began in September 7th, 1965 at Pease Air Force Base. An airman was taken aboard a ship from outer space. There, he met a female alien who asked her to feed him. And what did she desire? Strawberry ice cream push-ups. You can read the whole story at weekinweird.com. Well, there you are. The Kecksburg object was more than likely an alien craft that crashed here for whatever reason. I don't think it traveled from some distant star to get here. I think it may have come from the far side of our moon or maybe the bottom of the ocean. What do you think? Let me know if you get a chance. Send me a note at strangethings@arkanasa.com and let me know what you think the Kecksburg object might have been. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, don't tell anybody. Until next week, this is Chris James saying I hope you enjoyed tonight's show.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?